In Chapter 1, we're going to talk about the importance of ethics in the field of criminal justice. So let's start by talking about what do we mean by ethics. So ethics is a branch of philosophy. So in this course, we're going to study some of the philosophy, and then we're going to also apply it to criminal justice. And it's concerned with the study of questions of right and wrong and how we ought to live. Remember that right and wrong are moral judgments, and we assign that to our actions or to content. So within ethics, there's three branches: meta-ethics, normative ethics, and applied ethics. We're not going to talk too much about meta-ethics. This is the methods, language, logical structure, and reasoning used in how we interpret ethical terms. So when we talk about something being good or bad, what exactly does good mean? What exactly does bad mean? Normative ethics is concerning norms, right? So the ways we behave and standards of conduct. And applied ethics is concerned with solving practical moral problems as they arrive, particularly in the professions. And here we're looking at examples of medicine and law, but certainly pretty much any job you're going to have in criminal justice is going to deal with applied ethics, pretty much on a day-to-day basis. So let's start with, does the criminal justice system make the right decisions? And that's probably a pretty easy answer that no, it doesn't always make the right decisions. So let's start with, why should we be bothered with this? Well, first of all, how do we make a decision when we're confronted with some type of situation if we don't have any knowledge of ethics? And you've been gaining knowledge of ethics all throughout your life without it being taught to you explicitly as ethics. So if we don't have a set of rules or guidelines to help us with difficult moral issues, what do we rely on? Our emotions, our instinct, our personal values? And is that sufficient? So one notion in normative ethics is that when we behave, our conduct has to take into account moral issues. Okay, so we should use reason and to decide the proper way to behave. But what are those standards? How do we decide what is right and wrong? How do we decide what our behavior should look like? And can there be one standard of ethics? So ethical relativism says we make decisions based on each situation, whereas ethical absolutism says there's one set of rules and we should apply those to all situations and all people. So let's talk a little bit more about ethical relativism. Because standards of conduct vary from place to place, not just country to country, but even think about the United States and how different parts of the country are, we need to make ethical decisions based on each situation. And what might be right is going to vary from one place to another. Relativism doesn't mean we can't critique or criticize other people's behavior, but we have to judge them by their own cultural standards. Cultural relativism. So there's three forms of ethical relativism: ethical, cultural, and extreme. So ethical relativism is moral right and wrong, okay? But it also contends that what is right for one person or culture may be wrong for another. Cultural relativism is the idea that our beliefs and our moral practices vary from culture to culture. So we don't necessarily argue that certain things are right or wrong in a particular culture. We're going to simply note the differences. And then extreme or individual relativism says that moral beliefs and practices vary from person to person. So think again about some really hot topic kind of issues in the United States, things like abortion, gun control. Extreme or individual relativism would say those are going to differ from person to person. So cultural relativism, we want to remember that every society has a moral code. And under cultural relativism, we don't want to judge one moral code as superior or inferior to another, okay? We can't judge other societies by our own standards. We should judge them by their standards. But stop for a minute and think about if this is really a viable approach to ethics. This would basically allow other people to do really heinous things in the name of, you can't judge that because this is our moral code. So, problems here. First of all, what constitutes a culture or a society? If that difficulty exists, then it's really easy to see how we could end up somewhere where our own values start determining ethical standards. We also know that standards of conduct evolve over time, right? So what is considered acceptable behavior today was not acceptable, years ago, and what's considered acceptable today may not be acceptable in the future. Ethical absolutism says that there are one set of rules, they apply to everybody, and they apply to every situation. And we can use that to make decisions. The people qualified to pass judgment then are ethical absolutists because they do know the rules. And it doesn't really matter what your feelings or thoughts are. There are rules, you apply the rules, and that's what makes something ethical. Or that's what makes your behavior ethical, if you follow the rules. So for example, let's think about capital punishment and absolutism. There's two views here, okay? The murderer has to be given the punishment he or she deserves. The other absolutism rule could be there is no justification for judicial murder. So one thing to think about is, are there really universally accepted values? And if so, what are they? And if they exist, do they remain constant over time or do they change? Ethical pluralism is a way that we can resolve this, okay? So basically, this is the idea that in most situations, there are many truths rather than one single truth. And this allows us to adopt 4 principles to help resolve conflicts. And here they are. They're the principle of understanding, tolerance, standing up against evil, and fallibility. So let's look at each of these. Understanding. This requires that we fully understand and appreciate the meaning of ethical standards found in another culture, and that we do so from the perspective of that culture. So take, for example, female circumcision. You have to understand the historical and cultural context of the many cultures in which it is found. Tolerance is the idea that we're going to accept the existence of differences as opposed to denying that there's any diversity. This basically rules out the option of absolutism. The principle of standing up against evil, understanding and tolerance shouldn't lead us to a position where we say anything goes, okay? We should be prepared to stand up against really egregious, really heinous moral wrongdoing. So for example, something like genocide. And the final principle is principle of fallibility. We want to remember that we are fallible, okay? We should always be prepared to learn from other cultures and to have our own moral shortcomings exposed. So up until very recently, U.S. law allowed for capital punishment for people as young as 16 at the age they committed their crime. So we can be open to other views and still allow that some views are better than others. And we should also allow other people to make an argument to prove that their point of view could be correct. Now let's think about religion and ethical standards. So where do our ethical standards come from? A lot of people believe in divine command theory, okay? What is morally right is what God tells us, and what is wrong is what God tells us is wrong, okay? So then we want to think about what makes it right. Is it because God commands it, or do gods command it because it is right? You can see here where we're really getting into the philosophy piece. So let's look at the idea that conduct is right because God commands it. So if God commands our behavior under this viewpoint, that's all we need to know. That is sufficient. But how do we know what God wants? Well, we can use religious texts. How do we know which religious text? Is it only the Bible? What if there's no passage concerning the issue at hand? What if the information is conflicting? What if God gives one command and then gives a different command? Maybe God commands behavior because it is right. So maybe they're not arbitrary, but they come from his wisdom. So perhaps then there's some standard that means that there's some standard outside of God's will and independent of God's command. So if we set standards according to religion, that becomes highly problematic. What about natural law? Natural law is the idea that underneath all the diversity of a human culture is that there is a right and wrong. And we can identify some things that are common to our human nature. And this is an idea favored by Plato and Aristotle. So natural law, you may have learned about this when you learned about criminal law, says that laws that govern human behavior and define the right way to live. So they reflect our human nature, and we tend to gravitate more recently towards arguments in terms of favoring human rights. So what about ethics in the law? Is law the source of ethics? So law refers to legislation, statutes, and regulations made by the government for public good and welfare. So the federal government, state government, your local government. They're not intended to incorporate ethics, although at times they often reflect them. So both the law and morality tells us that it's wrong to kill people. Also remember that ethical standards are not necessarily written down. Your parents probably didn't give you a list of ethical rules written down on a piece of paper to study and learn. Some people also have to obey the law, but they don't necessarily have to follow ethics, and some laws may conflict with ethical standards. So, one thing to think about for those of you that are already working in the field, those of you that have interned in the field, and of course for those of you that are going to go into this field, or what are ethical dilemmas you might face, and you will face them in the field of criminal justice. You also then want to think about how would you deal with those, because you could take a variety of approaches. You could just say you're not responsible for making ethical decisions, you're just following orders. Okay? We also want to think about when is something a dilemma versus an ethical dilemma, and it becomes an ethical dilemma when the decision involves conflict at a personal, interpersonal, institutional, or societal level, and then raises issues of right or moral character. So how do we resolve an ethical dilemma? Initially, we often think about kind of what does our gut say, right? We use an intuitive level. Pretty simple principles. They come from what we've been told as we were brought up by our parents and our loved ones, and from our past experiences in making decisions. But this can be really insufficient. Critical thinking can be another method, right? This is where we think about principles established by philosophy, moral concepts, so it's non-intuitive. Okay, so we kind of think about those rules and we might try to apply them to the situation at hand. So let's think about a scenario. We've got a newly recruited correctional officer, Tom, and he overhears 3 other COs, Fred, Bob, and Charlie, discussing arrangements to assault an inmate named Raymond. Raymond has previously attacked another CO, a close friend of those 3 officers. So we want to think about how do we figure out if he has an ethical dilemma? Well, first we need information, right? So we want to gather all the facts and knowledge relevant to this decision, including our own values. Because it's an ethical dilemma, then he wants to think about ethical principles. How has he decided to live his life and how can he apply them? Moral judgments should be able to be applied universally. If I judge it wrong for you to cheat during an exam, then I have to think that if I cheat during an exam, that is also wrong. We want to be consistent in our moral judgments. So, just a kind of a quick overview. We're going to get into these in a lot of detail in our other chapters. Problems arise in terms of use of authority in criminal justice. Problems related to the relationships between personal and professional interests. Problems in personal and professional commitments to clients. And then also in terms of public policy. There's a lot of public policy we can look about here. And you are going to write a paper where you're going to look at a public policy and look at it from an ethical perspective. From policing policies, ethical problems in terms of information that we share, dealing with human rights, and how the media reports on crime. And that wraps up our chapter on the importance of ethics.